Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'rith. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for joining us today. Today, as we mark International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we're bringing you a timely conversation. I sit down with Dr. Robert Williams, the Finci-Viterbi Executive Director Chair of the USC Shoah Foundation, and an internationally recognized expert and governmental advisor on Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. Together, we delve into why understanding history is essential to Holocaust remembrance, the alarming trend of sanitizing and glorifying Nazi and fascist leaders, and how future generations can uphold the vital responsibility to never forget. Stay with us for this important discussion. Before we dive into today's conversation, though, a quick reminder, if you enjoy this program, be sure to subscribe to Conversations with B'rith wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook to stay updated with all of our latest content. This International Holocaust Remembrance Day marks 80 years since the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest Nazi concentration and extermination camp. Over 1.1 million people, nearly 1 million Jews, were murdered there. On January 27, 1945, Soviet forces entered Auschwitz to find 7,000 emaciated survivors, most ill and dying, and witnessed atrocities so horrific they could hardly believe their eyes. Well, now, 8 decades later, Holocaust distortion, denial, and trivialization are alarmingly on the rise. As the Shoah fades from living memory, the urgency of commemorating those who were murdered and confronting the dangers of bigotry and anti-Semitism have never been greater. To discuss these critical issues and more, I'm joined by Dr. Robert Williams, the Finci-Viterbi Executive Director Chair of the USC Shoah Foundation and a leading advisor on Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. We'll explore the ongoing challenges of Holocaust remembrance, including groundbreaking research, the troubling glorification of Nazis and their collaborators, and the increasingly vital role of education in safeguarding historical truth about the Shoah. Dr. Williams also serves as academic advisor to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, known as IHRA. And before joining the USC Shoah Foundation, he was Deputy Director of International Affairs at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Dr. Williams has played a pivotal role in shaping EU policies on Holocaust-related archives and combating anti-Semitism, advising governments and international organizations on Holocaust denial, distortion, and education. His research focuses on German political culture, U.S. and Russian cultural policy, and contemporary anti-Semitism. He recently published a co-edited volume on anti-Semitism, The Routledge History of Anti-Semitism, and is currently researching and writing a monograph on efforts to whitewash and rehabilitate the reputation of fascists and Holocaust perpetrators. He's also begun a project assessing the politics of Holocaust commemoration in the Western Balkans. Now, here's my interview with Executive Director Chair of the USC Shoah Foundation, Dr. Robert Williams. Rob, thank you for joining me as we honor the 6 million Jews murdered during the Shoah on this International Holocaust Remembrance Day, observed each January 27th to mark the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1945. 80 years later, we reflect not only on the past, but also on why the Holocaust and Holocaust education, Holocaust remembrance remains deeply imperative today. We value your insights as we explore these critical issues. So I want to start off with a question about you and about the USC Shoah Foundation. Tell us about how it all came about and a little about the work that you do.
Sure. So the USC Shoah Foundation, we celebrated our own anniversary last year. It was our 30th anniversary. We started on the backlot of Universal Studios, more or less at the same time as the filming of Schindler's List. And over the course of the past 30 years, joined the University of Southern California, built a testimony collection primarily focused on survivors of the Shoah. We have in that particular Shoah collection around 56,000 testimonies. Our total testimony size is around 61,000. Since I started 2 years ago, I have been taking the organization to deal with the hatred that animated the Holocaust, namely anti-Semitism, as a more serious topic of discussion. To that end, in addition to building our Holocaust-focused work, we've been building an initiative focused on other forms of anti-Semitism that have continued to plague us since 1945. We're building a separate collection of about 10,000 testimonies of Jewish survivors of anti-Semitic violence since the Holocaust as well.
As we mark this incredibly significant day for Jews around the world, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the current state of Holocaust research, in addition to all of the work that you're doing. But generally speaking, as we move away, now it's 80 years, the number of survivors, of course, dwindling simply because of the biological clock. What do you think needs to be done in order to perpetuate this very important aspect of Holocaust remembrance?
Yeah, it's a scary moment, as you're hinting at. We have, well, last year there were around 240,000 Holocaust survivors still alive around the world. That number has probably dwindled to less than 200,000. The vast majority of those live in Israel and the United States, and their memories will soon leave us in a direct sense. It'll be our job to remember their stories, but more importantly, to incorporate it into more scholarship, more robust, I would say, even broader education initiatives. And that's where I'm a little concerned. I'll be frank. You know, the Holocaust as an event is incredibly well documented. My former institution, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, has, I would say, in all of its collections, maybe 350 million pages of material. And that probably represents only a fraction of what is out there. And I have said, and Timothy Snyder has said, and other scholars as well, it's a rough estimate, but we've probably only utilized about 10% of that total archival record, including Holocaust survivor testimonies, testimonies of perpetrators and eyewitnesses, and of course, written documents left behind by the victims and the perpetrators. So if we've only scratched the surface, there's still a lot of work to be done. But a lot of scholars these days, archival work takes a long time. So I do notice in some fields a drift away from the archive toward theory. That's common in every discipline. Happens with different historical phenomena as well. But I would say even more troubling, the number of scholars able to access the languages of the Holocaust is smaller and smaller. We still have plenty of people who read German, plenty of people who read French, some who read Polish, some who read Hebrew, very few who are able to access Yiddish and all the variants of Yiddish that exist, even fewer who can read Ladino, so the Sephardic experience can get lost. Slavic languages are on the decline by and large. If we're going to continue to push knowledge forward to do service to the survivors and victims, we have to improve our language skills and use that archive. And so I'm a little worried. We need a true international initiative. Very, very quickly on the education front, I think our colleagues at the Claims Conference, who do these regular surveys looking at the state of Holocaust knowledge, have done a huge service because they shined a light on something that we've known anecdotally for a long time. Doesn't matter where you live, if you're in the United States, if you're in France, if you're in Poland, if you're in Romania, Holocaust knowledge is on the decline, particularly in countries where the Holocaust happened, and surprisingly, in a number of countries where Holocaust education is mandatory. That tells me that what we're teaching isn't sufficient. Or, at the very least, what we're teaching relies too much on 2 days when somebody's 15 years old, and we hope that'll do the job for the rest of their life. That's not enough.
How do new discoveries and ongoing research deepen our understanding of the history and relevance particularly in shaping attitudes and ensuring future generations to uphold the imperative of never forget, while also addressing current societal challenges. Now, you mentioned the 2 days for a high school student, kind of just a passing couple of days for that student. But with new revelations, perhaps new archives that are found somewhere in country A or country B in Europe, how does that all add to the deepening of our understanding? And then how, knowing all of this, and as you said, very small amount really has kind of been researched in detail, but in terms of the broader public, how does it deepen our understanding about memory and about perpetuating the memory of the victims?
The trick really is personalizing it, right? Why do so many people read biographies of Lincoln or the founding fathers of the United States? Because a biography is personal, right? You're able to identify something in the history of this great woman or this great man in history that resonates with you. I think good scholarship achieves the same thing, right? That's why certain fields like military history are less popular than they once were, and everyday life histories and social histories are on the rise. If you learn something in your research or in your reading of history, it's usually that individual story that brings you in. That explains I don't know if we should call it a phenomenon, but the popularity of the Diary of Anne Frank, the writings of Elie Wiesel, and others. There still is a lot of work to be done using Jewish sources to understand the Holocaust. And by that, I mean memoirs, diaries, letters that were written at the time, and of course, survivor testimonies. Because it's in those encounters with the individual that you learn a little bit about yourself. You see something that resonates with you personally, or something that reminds you of a relative. And that can be a way to build a strong psychological bond to the subject. Beyond that, from a scholarly perspective, it's often in these, other people use this term, these ego documents, these individually created documents, that you will get a glimpse of something that may not have ever occurred to you. I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, so I'll repeat myself, but you weren't part of the conversation, so it's fine to do that. Yesterday, I was talking to a friend about some research that I was asked to do in 2002, looking at letters that were written during the course of the Holocaust by people who ultimately became victims. And I remember one letter. It was a series of correspondence, actually, between an Austrian Jew who managed to make his way to the United States, and he was studying, I believe he was at Berkeley, it was one of the UC schools, and his parents, who were still in Austria, and this was after the German occupation and after deportations had started to begin. And in the correspondence, his father writes, we've seen this neighbor go, that neighbor go, your mother and I are old, we love you, but please know that we're going to commit suicide. That was the end of the correspondence. I was 25, 26 years old when I read this. I'd read a lot of secondary literature before, but this is the first mention of suicide that I had seen related to the Holocaust. A taboo topic was now a reality, something that, you could begin to research. At the same time, a different series of letters that I read were from a woman who was hiding in Poland with her sister underneath the barn. The farmer who was hiding them was essentially using them as slave labor, and there were hints of sexual violence in the letter as well. Again, another one of these taboo topics that you don't often read about in the books behind me on the shelf, but a reality of the Holocaust. These are areas of research today, and it's those encounters that often lead to that research.
Well, I want to talk about Holocaust revisionism, an area that you are doing a great deal of research in. I first heard the term as an undergraduate. I always point out I'm not a historian. I was a history major. I'm not a historian. There's a big difference. But I remember hearing the term for the first time in a course that I took about history of American foreign relations, about how the wheel turns and 20 or 25 years pass. And how do you look at World War I? How do you look at World War II? Or any other historical phenomenon? So sure. Let's focus on the most disturbing trends that you have studied and are studying, which is the false mythologies in European countries and elsewhere that recast World War II perpetrators as heroes or as martyrs. These issues were highlighted in the B'nai B'rith International Report on Europe's streets, for which you served as an advisor. Tell us more about these trends that have developed and, unfortunately, are spreading all the time.
It's unfortunately been with us since, we'll say, May 9th, 1945, right? These attempts to protect the legacies of villains. It's something that I would argue really began to grow after the end of the Cold War. I'll get into the reasons for that in a moment. Today, it's out of control, but it's important to note that it's not just a European phenomenon, right? Here in the United States, if you go to Huntsville, Alabama, what do you see? You see the Von Braun Convention Center. You see the Von Braun missile facility at the Department of Defense. Until the pandemic, there was a statue of Wernher von Braun in the middle of Space Camp, also in Huntsville, Alabama. Who was Wernher von Braun? Wernher von Braun did help us get to the moon, of course. He was one of the rocket scientists responsible for the development of NASA's rocket systems. He was a friend of Walt Disney. Elon Musk won the Wernher von Braun Prize, but Wernher von Braun was also a member of the SS, responsible for the production of the V-2 rocket program, which rained early missiles down upon the British people. But that was a rocket program only possible through the slave labor of thousands of Jews. So he should not have been brought to the United States under the terms of the Nuremberg decision. He was part of a criminal organization, but we have his name plastered throughout our country. In the Canyon of Heroes in New York City, you have plaques to some of the criminals of the Vichy France regime. To be fair, those plaques were put there for their service in World War I, but nevertheless, war criminals. And elsewhere in North America, whether you're in Wisconsin or you're in Canada, you'll see, or Chicago for that matter, you'll see statues to various Lithuanian or Ukrainian collaborators in Nazi crimes. This is truly a global phenomenon. It really doesn't matter if you live in a country that was a perpetrator country, in a country that was occupied by the Nazis or their allies, if you were in a neutral country like Spain, or on the side of the Allies, the United States, France, Great Britain, and even the states of the former Soviet Union. This is something that is shared. It's something that we need to deal with. And why is it happening? And it's simple. People are looking for convenient, usable pasts. In the case of the countries that used to be occupied and controlled by communist regimes, you can kind of understand how this happened. Their histories were taken from them in service to a Marxist ideology that lasted decades in the case of many of these countries. And after variously the fall of the wall or the fall of the Soviet Union, they began to search for heroes so that they could create an identity separate from that imposed upon them by Marxist Leninism, Stalinism. But in doing so, they looked for people who were part of the anti-communist resistance. Some of these individuals were worthy of honor. Others were part of the anti-communist resistance, but also collaborators with the Nazis or Nazi allied regimes. That makes things very complicated.
Why does trying to preserve historical truth, because that's what you're doing by uncovering and researching and writing about this. What is it about preserving historical truth that causes a certain defensiveness when all of this is revealed? And we see this time and again. And so is it the passage of time? Is it what is the element here that doesn't seem to allow for folks to say, whoa, I didn't know that, or I had no idea. And so let's remove that plaque, or let's remove that statue. What do you think is going on here in terms of the mindset?
Well, in the research I'm doing for this forthcoming book, I identify about a dozen different motivations. I won't get into all of those at this time. They run the spectrum, though. Some emerge somewhat innocently, right? In the attempt to find heroes, you'll find something. We'll take the anti-communists, for example. If you hate communism and you want your heroes to be anti-communists, you'll gravitate toward those individuals. And sure, they may have done a few bad things in their youth, but overall, they were decent enough guys because they fought against an evil regime. Sometimes the motivations are a little more, we'll call them financially driven. I'll give you there's two cases that took place in the early 2020s. One was in Romania, the other was in Slovenia. In the Romanian case, the family of a perpetrator who was largely responsible for the Odessa massacre went to the court and said, please overturn our grandfather's conviction. We would like access to his property. The Romanian courts, to their credit, said, it's not in keeping with our laws, and it's dangerous to honor such individuals. So the family of Nicolae Macic did not get their day in court. In contrast, in Slovenia, the family of Leon Rupnik, who was the Nazi collaborator who oversaw Ljubljana, also went to court to try to access his property. They were successful. The Slovenian Supreme Court decided that the Yugoslav partisan trial that decided that Rupnik's crimes warranted his being tried and then shot. They said that because it was a communist court, well, it was an invalid decision, so they overturned his death sentence in 2021. He's still dead, by the way, Dan. Don't worry, he didn't come back to life. But by overturning his death sentence, they opened the door to him being seen, at least in some sectors of Slovenian society, as somehow legitimate, somehow redeemed or whitewashed or cleansed. Other motivations, religion comes into play, especially among some Roman Catholics. So there are Roman Catholic nuns who ran concentration camps for children, mostly ethnic Serbian children in Croatia. A couple of these nuns have been, one of them is actually on a list to be beatified by a local Roman Catholic diocese. Others have had their records. It's hard to get to those details. And then, quite honestly, I think the most dangerous of the motivations is a sense, whether it is an angry, cynical sense or a more innocent sense, that the Holocaust is Jewish history. It's different from our national history, whether that national history is Hungarian or American or Lithuanian is somewhat secondary. That Jewish history is somehow separate. And if Jewish history is separate, then we can condemn the Holocaust. Yes, I think say it's bad, but that shouldn't prevent us from reintegrating the poetry of this anti-Semite into the national curriculum, or having a street name for this individual who shaped our anti-Jewish policies, plastered all over the Western Balkans. This separation of understanding of our shared past, I think, is a major motivation as well.
This veneration is not just plaques and statues. No. There are marches, there is paraphernalia, there are paramilitary uniforms. How much of this do you think is driven in the 21st century by social media?
A considerable amount. I think the rise in popularity of certain runic symbols is largely social media driven, because you didn't see much of this in the 1990s or 1980s. A lot of these runic symbols were used by Nazi-affiliated organizations, whether those were in Belgium or Northern Europe, and those symbols today have been reappropriated by neo-Nazi groups and made somewhat popular, even by the Flemish Parliament every now and then. So that's one way that that social media plays a role. I would say the other way social media is playing a role is by shining a light on lesser known figures, right? It's generally contemptible to put a photograph on your wall of Adolf Hitler or any of his high-ranking coterie. Same would be true of Mussolini, but it's perfectly acceptable by, we'll call them far-right Catholic groups, to praise the writings of certain fascist quasi-intellectuals, pseudo-intellectuals, whose writings today have become extremely popular, not just in Italy, but among the far right and Roman Catholics here in the United States as well. Because these names are not as well known, it can kind of slide below the radar, and it can achieve some positive cachet in certain social media circles as well.
Are these groups primarily seeking public approval, or are they focused on recruiting adherents, or both? Or is there more to it?
I don't think there's one single goal, but yes, I think the answer is yes to all the above. There's an attempt to legitimize one's heroes because you want other people to like what you like, right? You see a lot of this we did see a lot of this in Hungary several years ago. It began with attempts to restore the reputation of Admiral Miklos Horthy, who was the regent in charge of Hungary, first when Hungary was a member of the Axis, and then became a puppet of the Nazis following the German occupation of Hungary in 1944. Attempts to say that Horthy really did not want to participate in the murder of Jews. That's ahistorical, and that pushed against attempts by the Hungarian government to restore Horthy's particular reputation. The same thing happened with lesser-known members of the Hungarian elite in the 1940s. A couple of these individuals have had their works reintroduced only within the last couple of years into Hungary's education curriculum. And although, to be fair, their anti-Semitic writings aren't what Hungarian students are reading today, if you're reading an individual's work, there's a very good chance you might be inspired to read more of their work, and eventually you're going to hit their anti-Jewish worldviews. That's really where the problem begins.
Is an underlying narrative consistent across these movements? And here I would include the left, the far left, as well as the right. Specifically, the portrayal of Jews as perpetrators rather than as victims of the Holocaust. And does this revisionism, are they looking to absolve governments and individuals who carried out or collaborated in genocide? And right now we're confronted by this global phenomenon, this blood libel of genocide against Israel. I often think that many have joined in this chorus against Israel, particularly in Europe, to kind of whitewash or eliminate the guilt which is associated with what collaborators and worse did during the Shoah and World War II.
Yeah, there's whether it's a conscious or a subconscious. Well, it's suspicious, let's say, because it is convenient for one to castigate and engage in anti-Semitism today, while at the same time these efforts at rehabilitation happen. It seems to invite the development of a view that the Jews ultimately deserved it. That's extremely dangerous. We've heard extremists on both sides of the ideological spectrum say this. There is, of course, this well-known horseshoe phenomenon that the farther one swings left, they're eventually going to hit the extreme right, and the farther one swings right, they're going to hit the extreme left. I think there is a large degree of truth in that. The one thing that unites both groups, as well as Islamist and hard right Catholic extremists, is their hatred of Jews. So there's a degree of synergy there. But in answer to your larger question, I think we're facing a few large challenges today. The notion of a Jewish conspiracy is something that's shared on the extreme right and the extreme left. This even plagues Holocaust studies. There will be some, very few, but some scholars and activists who will say, we've done enough on the Holocaust. We need to focus on other atrocities, as if there's a black and white decision to be made. And, in fact, I think the emphasis on the Holocaust is there to cover up Jewish crimes and perfidy today. This is something that is said in some academic circles. That's extremely dangerous, in my opinion, because what is it? It's ultimately saying the Jews have a conspiracy. That's the only reason we're talking about the Holocaust, the oldest anti-Semitic trope. The other challenge that I see today is essentially the tendency to wipe one's hands clean of the Holocaust. And this happens a number of different ways. One, of course, is turning villains into heroes, right? Restoring the reputations of these men and women who were complicit in the crimes against the Jewish people in the mid-20th century. Another is, I think I touched on this earlier, insufficient Holocaust education. You and I, Dan, have been in a number of international fora where we'll see an ambassador stand up and say, we have mandatory Holocaust education. Job done. We're doing the right thing by the Jews. Well, we know that mandatory Holocaust education could take a number of different forms, but more often than not, it's a couple of hours in the life of an individual where they're learning about what happened in Nazi Germany, which might be fine if you're German, but if you're in, I'll pick a random country, if you're in the Netherlands, and all you're learning about is what happened in Germany, well, that makes the Holocaust something that happened over there. You're not going to personalize it enough to actually affect change. That means that the Holocaust and education on the Holocaust is at risk over the long term. 80 years since the since the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, at least, that's a dangerous moment. That means that Holocaust education can become secondary. It could lead to study or education on the Holocaust becoming just as popular as study or education on the War of 1812. And that's not exactly something we want for the future.
A couple more questions before we conclude. You mentioned Huntsville, Alabama. Mm-hmm. And perhaps you could talk a little bit more about North America. But I'm interested in, when we talk about this country and Europe, how do legal frameworks here compare to those in Europe when it comes to curbing Holocaust denial and hate speech? And this was one of the main questions in our report on Europe's streets sought to answer. How do they compare?
Well, they're incomparable in a lot of ways, but they're also incomparable within Europe. I'll start at the broadest level. I think by my last count, which I haven't looked into this in a couple of years, but by my last count, 27 of the 48 member states of the Council of Europe had Holocaust denial laws on the books. Now, those laws aren't exactly uniform, which is part of the problem. The vast majority of those laws are modeled on a law passed in France called the Gay-Sceaux Act, which makes denying the Holocaust criminal. Okay, so far so good. A few of these laws have undergone several major revisions over the last few years, beginning in the Russian Federation. The Russians changed their law a couple of times. I wrote about this a couple of years ago for, I think it was the Israeli Journal of Foreign Affairs, such that today's law in the Russian Federation essentially says that if you insult the Soviet Union vis-a-vis the Holocaust, you can be arrested and fined. This has led to the arrests of several people who have been historically accurate by saying that the Soviet Union was allied with Nazi Germany in 1939 at the start of World War II, and that alliance did not fall apart until the start of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. Well, because the Russians revised their law, what happened? The Ukrainians revised their law. The Ukrainians then changed their law such that insulting the memory of certain Ukrainian heroes from history became punishable by law or fine. That in turn led the Poles, who experienced their own tragedies at the hands of a number of these Ukrainian nationalists in 1944 and 1945, to revise their law. Again, same pattern. If you insult any heroes of Poland, or in fact the Polish people in the context of the era of the Second World War, when Nazi Germany occupied Poland, you can be punished by law. So what we're seeing is a number of these Holocaust laws being revised to affirm certain state-mandated interpretations of the history of the Second World War and the Holocaust era. That's extremely dangerous. this could lead to an effect in other countries. Here in North America, our freedoms of speech and expression are much more open, thankfully, I would argue, than those in Europe. But that also means it's a bit of a Wild West situation at times. You have the opportunity to really not punish the misuse of history or forms of anti-Semitism that can be expressed through the misuse of history here in the United States, unless there is a provable risk to public safety, which there are certain acts that have been pushed by the Biden administration, and by administrations before the Biden administration, that may be utilized if we can prove risk. But I don't think that those have been deployed in the case of Jewish issues. They've been deployed in the case of other forms of domestic terrorism risk.
Finally, in the context of today's surge, really should be tsunami, in global anti-Semitism, what advice, as a scholar, as an educator, what advice about educating future generations do you have to offer? We're in Wild West when it comes to social media. It's out there.
Yeah.
How can we ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust are remembered and applied in a way that strengthens our commitment to combating hatred and to preserving historical truth?
So I'll start with the positive. If you look at public opinion polls, even the Pew surveys, the vast majority of Americans here in the United States really at least are ambivalent about Jews, but don't actively hate Jews. And the numbers shift, but they're in the high 70%. I think that indicates that the vast majority of Americans know that anti-Semitism is wrong. Part of the problem, of course, is they wouldn't recognize most forms of anti-Semitism if they were standing in front of them, waving their hands and shouting, because of, in part, of the success of Holocaust knowledge, no matter the depth of that knowledge. As a result, most individuals, when they think of an anti-Semite, are thinking of a guy wearing an armband, saying terrible things or engaging in terrible acts. Well, anti-Semites rarely are considerate enough to wear armbands to shine a light on the fact that they are terrible. An anti-Semite can be somebody wearing a swastika, but it can also be the kindly old lady down the hall from you. You never quite know because you can't recognize the various forms. It can be religious, as you know, it can be tied to a certain form of racism, and it can sometimes express itself through various forms of anti-Israel or anti-Zionist critique. We have a job ahead of us to educate people on all of the forms of anti-Semitism that are out there. That is why certain educational resources, like the IHRA Working Definition of Anti-Semitism, in full disclosure, I am the advisor to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. That's why those are so useful, because although they're not perfect tools, they begin the process of getting people to understand that anti-Semitism takes these different forms. The other challenge we have, though, is really where the Holocaust fits in bringing people to understand anti-Semitism, the Jewish experience, and the ways that we're interconnected writ large. I would argue, and this might sound strange, coming from an individual who runs an organization primarily focused on the Holocaust and somebody who's dedicated his career to studying the Holocaust. But I think we do a disservice if we only use the Holocaust as a morality tale in the hopes that it's going to lead to less anti-Semitism. The Holocaust was the most terrible moment of anti-Semitic violence in human history, yes. But that was 4 years in at least 2,300 years of anti-Jewish violence in our shared history. And if we hope to open people's eyes so that they respond to anti-Semitism by only teaching them the history of something that happened about 80 years ago, I don't think we're going to be successful. So what's the solution? Part of it is to show people that anti-Semitism continued after 1945. That's why the USC Shoah Foundation has begun working on these issues. Part of it is showing the interconnected nature of anti-Semitism, right? Just as the anti-Semitism is not polite to always wear an armband, polite enough to always wear an armband, neither will the anti-Semite restrict their hatred just to Jews by and large. There are ways that anti-Semitism informs other types of hatred and is informed by other types of hatred. Take the shooting that took place in Buffalo a couple of years ago, at the Buffalo supermarket shooting. The actor in that case wanted to start a race war targeting Jews, but started his attack by focusing on African Americans. If we don't overcome, and it's worth noting that a number of these other causes can be at times anti-Jewish in their expressions. If we don't overcome that, we're going to sink. The other important piece of this, though, is to also teach people of the long history of anti-Semitism. October 7th, right? The first things that we heard on October 7th were about the shootings, the kidnappings, and the violation of the women, particularly at the Nova Festival. As an historian who is a historian of the 20th century, the resonance for me, beyond the immediate horror of the moment and calling my friends to make sure they were okay, it seemed very similar to the pogroms that took place in Transnistria, in the former Russian Empire. Why? Because more often than not, Jewish women were the first object of attack, be it by the Cossacks or by local populations. There are parallels. We need to understand these parallels if we're going to ever push back. So we need to do more than just focus on the Holocaust.
Rob, thank you for this vitally important conversation on the eve of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Your invaluable work reminds us that Holocaust remembrance is not just about understanding history, but also about confronting today's challenges and threats and safeguarding where we can for the future. It's been a pleasure, as always, speaking with you. We greatly appreciate your sharing your insights today, including your ongoing research into the rehabilitation of Nazis and their collaborators. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you for your leadership of B'nai B'rith.
Well, this wraps up another insightful episode of Conversations with B'nai B'rith. A tremendous thank you to Dr. Robert Williams for joining me, and to you, our listeners and our viewers. Thank you for tuning in. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Share this episode with others. Post about it on social media, or leave us a comment or a rating. Stay updated, follow or subscribe to Conversations with B'nai B'rith wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like us on Facebook for more great content. We'll be back soon with more important discussions on the issues that matter most to the Jewish community and beyond. Until next time, for my guest, Dr. Robert Williams, this is your host, Dan Mariaschin. Take care, everyone. Okay, no ins and outs on the audio or video, no freezing or anything. Good.
No, I mean, the only thing was if you had wanted to move over a little bit, you were sort of drifting to your right.
Am I right? Yeah.
But if other than that, it was good.
We'll leave it. You want to do it again? We can do it again. We can do it again.
It's totally up to you.
All right, let's do it more. You know what? Tell you what, we'll do it again, and you'll let me know which one works.
That's fair.
Okay, here we go. Take 3 or 4. How about this? Let me try this. Here we go. Well, this wraps up another insightful episode of Conversations with B'nai B'rith. Tremendous thank you to Dr. Robert Williams for joining me, and to you, our listeners and our viewers. Thank you for tuning in. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Share this episode with others, post about it on social media, or leave us a comment or a rating. Stay updated, follow us, or subscribe to Conversations with B'nai B'rith wherever you get your podcasts. And to be sure, this is what happens when you do too many of these. Alex, you can overdo it.
I hear you.
All right, we'll do one more, and it'll be a full take.
Okay.
Here we go. Well, this wraps up another insightful episode of Conversations with B'nai B'rith. A tremendous thank you goes to Dr. Robert Williams for joining me, and to you, our listeners and our viewers. Thank you for tuning in. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Share this episode with others, Post about it on social media or leave us a comment or a rating. To stay updated, follow or subscribe to Conversations with B'nai B'rith wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like us on Facebook for more great content. We'll be back soon with more important discussions on the issues that matter most to the Jewish community and beyond. Until next time, for my guest, Dr. Robert Williams, this is your host, Dan Mariaschin. Take care, everyone.